tonight it's really my pleasure to again have another conversation on compassion. And we've had a few now, and they've all just been wonderful. This one is particularly meaningful to me because I get to talk with my dear friend Jinpa, who I think doesn't need a whole lot of introduction to many of you. He is a Geshe, a former monk, who has been the primary English translator for His Holiness for the last quarter century. That seems like an incredible amount of time, and he looks so young. Additionally, he received a BA from Cambridge with honors in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies. He's also been the co-author and translator of many of His Holiness's books. And I met him actually at my first meeting with His Holiness when I asked him actually to come to Stanford for the first time. And it was actually an extraordinary meeting. And maybe I'll ask Jinpa to give his views of it, but His Holiness had come in, and my goal was actually to get His Holiness to come and give a talk at Stanford on compassion. There was no center. I had been doing just some research with colleagues I had talked into doing some projects, and really we had just really gotten started. And I had talked to Jinpa on the phone. He had arranged this meeting, and we chatted with His Holiness. He immediately agreed to come. One of the things that fascinated me, actually, though, was, especially being from Silicon Valley, His Holiness immediately agreed to come, and he said, let's put it on the books. Well, I assumed that they would bring out an iPad or a computer, and there would be somebody typing this in, and a monk came out with this big ledger, a paper ledger, and he starts going like this and unfolding these pages and then going down the whole list. So it was really quite extraordinary. But it was really, though, what followed after that, where His Holiness and I had been in a discussion about what his interests were in the work we were doing and what would be most meaningful to him. And the thing he said, and I think one of the reasons many of you were here, he said education, and it was the education of compassion, and most especially within our youth, children, because when children learn early in their life the importance of connecting with others, recognizing the suffering of others, it sets the tone for the rest of their lives. And but actually what I'd like to have Jinpa tell you, though, is at the end of the discussion, His Holiness was quite animated, and actually he had switched from English to Tibetan, and they began this discussion, and then what happened at that point, and then we'll start our conversation on compassion.
His Holiness turned to me, and he was impressed by the fact that something like this could be done at Stanford University. And also, His Holiness is, I don't know if any of you, many of you might have already been aware that, science is something that has been very dear to his heart for a long, long time. And he has had, many years of conversations with scientists. So the fact that this was going to happen at Stanford, and particularly it's going to be under the medical school with scientists, taking interest in doing research, he thought that was very significant. And then he wanted to actually make a personal contribution. And then the rest you can say.
Yeah, so, here I was simply to get him to come to Stanford. And actually at the end of the conversation, Jinpa turned and he said, His Holiness wants to make a personal contribution, which turned out to be the largest contribution he's made to a non-Tibetan cause. And, for me, it was really overwhelming and extraordinary. And that, fundamentally, he became our founding benefactor. And we've been blessed by having a number of people who have been contributors to our work. And in fact, two of those individuals who, as soon as His Holiness made this contribution, actually came forth and said, Jim, this is extraordinarily important work. Those two individuals, one was Ming, who many of you know as, what do they call him? The jolly good fellow at Google. And the other is here, right there, Wayne Wu, who's been a dear friend of mine for many years. And now we have the Ming Wu lectureship. So it's...
Actually, I think you joined us at Seattle meeting, didn't
That's
you?
right. Yes. Wayne was there, exactly. So it's really wonderful. In these conversations, one of the things I'm always interested in is we all know your great accomplishments, your involvement with His Holiness. One of the things I didn't mention is the fact that you founded and the Institute of Tibetan Classics translates a number of the sacred texts of Tibetan Buddhism. But there's always a backstory. How does somebody get from to where they're at now? What was the transition? What was the path? And maybe many of you may not know Jinpa's story and about his background, and maybe you could tell us a little bit.
Where to start? Actually, I grew up in India as a child, and I could say that in a sense, my life is typical of Tibetans of my generation, my age. I was born in Tibet, but when my parents left, I was barely a year old. So in fact, I grew up my entire life in India as a child. And one of the tragic part of that experience was that, you have these thousands of Tibetans come into exile as refugees in India, where they are totally unequipped to be in the modern world. They don't speak Hindi, they don't speak English. So what do you do? How do you support this, massive group of people? And one of the things that was really helpful was the Indian government, in collaboration with the Tibetan exile establishment, organized employment opportunities for majority of these Tibetans. The question is, what can they do? So for the first time, India now had to take care of a huge border with, international border with China. In the past, it was a Tibetan border, but now it is international border between Tibet and China, and that whole over 1,000 kilometers of border has to be protected, and they needed, motorable roads for the military, vehicles to go up to the borders. So that was a perfect opportunity for the Tibetans, and my parents were part of those thousands of Tibetans who worked on the road construction camps. But the downside of that is, what do you do with small children? So, and I remember actually, I was put in boarding school at the age of 4.5, but, I had the opportunity to visit my parents fairly often because one of those roads was from Shimla, and my school was in Shimla. But I do remember, every now and then when I had a chance to visit my family, there were children who were, too small to go to school, but parents have to work on road construction camps, and there would be a rope tied around their waist, and there would be a post quite close to where the mother is working, and all the mothers are sitting down and breaking rocks, turning them into sort of chips. So, and that's how, I grew up, and my story isn't any particularly unique. My story is the same as thousands of children of my age. But then, interestingly, where my story sort of diverges is I left school after grade 4 to become a monk. And of course, my father was completely against it because I was doing rather well at school. And, refugee family, seeing a child doing well at school, thinking that this is going to be a bread earner for the family. But I just wanted to be a monk. So I became a monk. And then after that, the monastery moved down to South India. And eventually, I was able to join an academic monastery. And the academic monasteries are quite impressive, almost kind of medieval European university style, very, very intellectually stimulating environment. And I just happened to be one of those really few weird monks who had a facility with English. So the fact that I became His Holiness interpreter was purely, coincidence, an accident. I mean, it's, I believe personally that many important things in life, you don't really plan. They just happen. Including finding your own spouse. This generally tends to be accidental. You can't plan. So my privilege of serving His Holiness as his principal interpreter was one of those accidents. I happened to be visiting Dharamsala because my monastery was in South India, and His Holiness was scheduled to give a series of teachings, and the official interpreter they have arranged for that particular series of teachings was not able to arrive on the first day. So they were looking for someone to stand for that monk. And the word spread around that there is this young monk who can speak English and who's a good student. And so one thing led to another. I was just plugged out from where I was sitting at the audience and asked to interpret. But fortunately, the translation was done simultaneously through an FM radio, so it was less scary because, when His Holiness teaches and then you have to translate and everybody's silent, then it can be very nerve-wracking. But if it is done simultaneously through an FM, so basically, there's no silence, so it was less nerve-wracking. But and the next day, the interpreter came, and then His Holiness looked at us and he said, "There are two of you. Why didn't you alternate?" So we started alternating, and then there was probably about 400 or 500 Western, Dharma students who were listening to the teachings through the FM radio. So we got a note saying, "Can the first interpreter do it? Because it's too jarring to switch between two styles." So I said to my colleagues, "Let me do the first part of the teachings 3 days, and then you do the others." By the third day, His Holiness, the secretary called me up and he said, "His Holiness is curious. He wants to see you." And then I had an audience, and His Holiness looked at me and said, "I know you. You're a good student." Because in the South Indian monastic universities, the primary medium is a sort of a Socratic-style debate, which I don't know if any of you have seen images. They're quite boisterous gestures, standing up and clapping and stamping your feet. And so it's a very, very analytic kind of, dialectical style of reasoning, and His Holiness visits the South Indian monasteries fairly frequently. So he recognized my face from one of those, visits, and he said, "I know you," but he said, "But I never knew that you spoke English." So he was kind of a little puzzled, like thinking, how is it that I did not know you, kind of thing. So then he asked me to see. He said, "Will you be able to make yourself available if I need you to travel with me and assist me?" Of course, for a Tibetan, that's the greatest honor. And, of course, I cried and said, never in my dream I ever thought, I'll have this kind of privilege. And the rest is history. So that was in 1985. So some of you may not even been born then.
Well, and somehow between 1985 to now, you're married with 2 children.
Yes.
Maybe you can just tell us. I'm sure everyone is interested.
Actually, when I occasionally at some of the events, especially in a smaller group, His Holiness likes to tease me, especially in front of friends. And he once referred to me and looked at me and told others that he's just left his monkhood, but on the other hand, he doesn't realize that he's actually going to now experience real suffering.
His wife is so sweet. There is no.
But I think the thing is, maybe I'm trying to psychoanalyze myself, but one of the things that really kind of never went away and became quite strong later in my sort of adult life is a kind of a yearning for family. And I suppose it may have to do with my own childhood experience, when I was sent away at age 4.5, and my mother passed away when I was very, very young. And then after that, my father joined a monastery. And so I never really had a real family life in the traditional sense. And, all of you know that Tibetan society is very traditional, and family is very important. So, and I've seen my cousins on my mother's side, they have large families, and how, cousins of my age, had that kind of family life. So I think that yearning was quite strong, and, that maybe all of you know that, part of the condition for being a Tibetan Buddhist monk is celibacy. So it's a bit like in the Catholic kind of tradition. And so you either be a monk and be celibate, or you either have a family. So you can't have it both ways. So when I went to Cambridge, I was still a monk. And I came back still a monk after 3 years of my undergraduate. And I thought maybe I've come to terms with the fact that I'll, probably see myself as growing and, old as a monk. But it wasn't to be. And then, eventually I made the decision that, I didn't really want to live that kind of life where there was at the core of my existence, there was a question. And, either I wanted to be completely committed and dedicated to my celibacy as a monk, or, just get out of it. And and also, once you finish your studies, you become a senior monk. And then if you leave the monastic order too late, the damage it will do to the system was greater. So there was also that moral dimension. So it was not only a matter of personal, questions. So that's why finally I made the decision that it's probably better to. But having said that, I truly am grateful that I left school and became a monk. Because if I had gone through the school system, the kind of life that I've been able to lead probably wouldn't be possible. So I'm truly grateful that I became a monk, had all those years of experience. And looking back also, I realized that my monastic years have also given me a lot of tools and skills that were surprisingly very relevant to a family life.
Yeah. We were talking about His Holiness making these jokes. So Jinpa and I and my daughter, who's 31, actually had an audience with His Holiness, and we were chatting. And at the end of our conversation, we took a picture with His Holiness. And His Holiness started giggling, and he said, "Jinpa, I'm going to send Sophie this picture because my daughter's arm was around Jinpa." So he has a wonderful sense of humor. And he did send the picture, actually. A couple other interesting points that some of you may not know, or maybe you do know, is after His Holiness had agreed to come to Stanford, Jinpa and I engaged in a number of conversations. And for the last 3 years, he has spent a week a month here with us at Stanford. And in great part is very much responsible for the success of this work. And I really want to acknowledge that he lives in Montreal. And so it's been not only critical to our success, but it's been a wonderful blessing for me. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Now, the other thing that's actually happened over the last year or so is Jinpa has actually become, has always been very involved with Mind and Life, and was for a period, I think, the CEO more recently, and is now chairman of the board of Mind and Life. And for those of you who don't know what Mind and Life is, it's an organization that for the last, 25 years has actually been promoting the study of Tibetan Buddhism and using neuroscience. And Francisco Varela was one of the co-founders, and Adam Engel. And it's really grown extraordinarily, and I think probably many of you have attended some of the conferences or at least seen them. And it's really had an extraordinary impact on not only the development of contemplative neuroscience, but in many ways actually the beginning of this exploration of the neuroscience of compassion. So it's really been quite exciting. And Jinpa has actually gotten more and more involved with the science side of this. And one of the things I would like to ask, although I think I know a little bit of the answer, but maybe you can give me more insight. Clearly, as a monk, you have been very involved with the tenets of Tibetan Buddhism, and we talk about the philosophy and the science. We've seen His Holiness as a model of compassion and promoting this principle. But why do you think this is so important? Because fundamentally, obviously, you've spent a great deal of the last 3 years here, and Sophie's still mad at me. But that's his wife. I'm just kidding. But he spent the last, 3 years, a week, a month here. You go all over the world, and this has really become a very important part of your life. And maybe you can tell us why you feel that is so important.
Frankly, I sort of got dragged into this whole conversation between Buddhism and science, primarily by virtue of the fact that I was serving His Holiness. So I really cannot take personal credit for taking interest in this. But as I got more and more involved in the conversation, then of course, I started getting very interested myself. But primarily my motivation was really to kind of, educate myself so that I can serve His Holiness in the best, possible way I can, so that his conversations and engagement with scientists can be very, very deep. But then, of course, Mind and Life has been the primary platform for many of these conversations, and it's not just about promoting contemplative study of, contemplative practices, but initially it was, of course, more of a kind of private forum for His Holiness to have an opportunity to engage deeply with top scientists, to be exposed to what are the new frontiers of scientific thinking and discovery. But, and because he has been very interested in all of this before. But over time, His Holiness also became, quite convinced that this is actually a larger conversation. It's beyond his own personal interest. And in some ways, he also felt very strongly that the Tibetan traditional Buddhist worldview really needs to engage and have a real encounter with modernity, and scientific worldview being an important part of that modernity. And so the Mind and Life conversations began to assume that kind of tenor of two intellectual traditions, coming into conversation. And then, of course, gradually, His Holiness, in fact, in 2001, I think that was when His Holiness threw a challenge to the scientists who were gathered there. He said, we have had these kind of conversations for many years now, and both sides agree that we learn a lot from this, we all enjoy, it's very enriching, intellectually stimulating, but at the end of the day, there's a real world out there. But what can we do? Can we do something out of our experience and understanding to make a real impact in the world? And that was immediately after the Mind and Life discussion. The topic was destructive emotions. And so that was very, very kind of pertinent. There was statistics showing about, the kind of percentage of adult population in the West in general, particularly in North America, who have some form of mental illness that requires medication, So for His Holiness and the Tibetan monastics who were present at these discussions, it was quite alarming when you look at the percentage. So then His Holiness threw this challenge, and then Mind and Life took up that challenge. And the first real public event we had was 2003 at MIT. So that was like the kind of coming out party. And since then, Mind and Life has been very successful in, promoting research with the Summer Research Institute and all of this. So those who are interested can, visit the website and take a look at this. Just a little correction. I was never really at the executive level. I was never part of the CEO. Been member of a board for quite a while. And recently I sort of said yes to the chairman position because we were going through a leadership transition where we now have transitioned from a founder-based organization to a kind of a mainstream organization because it has grown a lot. And so we were in the process of searching for a new executive. So, there needed to be some kind of stability and the continuity. So, all my colleagues on the board asked me if I could take on this position. And maybe partly because probably, I'm the least contentious. I don't know. But maybe the one factor is that, besides His Holiness and Adam Angle, probably I was the only person who have been throughout all the discussions since it began in '87. So, to come back to the compassion story, but Jim, CK's success is primarily due to your visionary leadership. You are a real connector. You pull people together. And one thing about Jim that I've noticed is that Jim has a very active mind, and he really wants to save the world, And, Jim can be very, very persuasive. I came when Jim opened up this conversation of me coming over. I said, first I said, look, when His Holiness comes, I'm part of the package anyway, so you don't need to reach out to me. I'll be there. He said, no, I want you to. So I said, well, let's. So I came over to have a long conversation with Jim, and I said to him, look, if you need my context to help get monastics come through and be scanned and have that kind of, I said, I'll be very happy to facilitate all of this, but there's no need for me to be, actively on the ground. But on the other hand, I said, if you really want to engage deeply at the conceptual level, because the scientific study of this field is very, very new, whether it's altruism, whether it's compassion, the whole positive psychology domain is very new to science. Western science, if you look at it, has been very impressive in the study of the human disease, mental illness. You have this big Bible, DSM, It's been fantastic. But when it comes to the positive qualities of the human mind, there's nothing. Hardly anything. So it's a very new field. So therefore, I was very interested in being part of a conversation in a group where we can have a real impact, where perspectives of philosophy and the world's spiritual traditions can be brought in at an early stage in conversation with scientists so that they don't run away with some kind of idea. Because one of the interesting things about science is very, very efficient. It's practical, and it does things, and it's cumulative, unlike philosophy and religion. Philosophy and religion, 2,000 years ago, they may be debating something, and even now they might be probably debating the same thing. But science is cumulative. It collects a body of knowledge, it adds on to it, and then it becomes a sort of almost like a dogmatic position, then it moves on. So, and interesting thing is that this establishment of CCARE happened, what I would say, again, in some sense, it's a historical accident at a perfect time, because it was established at a time when scientific methodology is becoming very sophisticated to study mental processes with the invention of imaging technologies. 20 years ago, these things were not possible. So then if you look at the way, scientific discipline of psychology 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it's very, very dominated by computational models. So they mainly study perception, visual kind of, processes. And so that was more of because there was no technology. Now with the invention of imaging technologies, scientists are now brave enough to touch the world of emotion, which was previously thought to be too fuzzy. Now scientists can deal with emotions. And now, they are beginning to get deeper and deeper. So at this stage, I thought, and I spoke with Jim and I said, look, if you are willing to provide a forum at Stanford where you will bring together people from multiple disciplines to have a real conversation so that we can look at these questions like altruism, compassion, love, forgiveness, and all these what philosophers would call moral sentiments. It's the Anglo-American tradition refers to these as moral sentiments, which in it previously was thought to be only the kind of purview of philosophical inquiry. But now it's becoming possible for scientists to study. So at that stage, I said to Jim, if you're really willing to do something like this, I said, I'll be very happy to be part of that conversation. And I think, and that's why CK, right from the beginning, has adopted this approach where our approach is very multidisciplinary. We have neuroeconomists as part of our team. We have neuroscientists, we have clinical psychologists, we have contemplative scholars, we have philosophers. And I think that's the way to go, because otherwise, scientists sometimes, because science as a discipline is so successful, there's inevitably a hubris that comes with it, which is very human. Because when you are successful, hubris comes along with it. And then they start redefining many of the terms that philosophers and religious scholars have been discussing, as if the 2,000-year-old conversation doesn't matter at all. I mean, that can't be right. So for example, like now, if you look at some of the naive presentations on supposedly research on altruism, they are redefining what altruism means. Altruism has nothing to do with the motivation. Altruism is a behavior that involves a cost to the person. But whereas if you look at spiritual traditions, altruism has always something to do with the motivation. The motivation, if the primary motivation is to help the other, the act coming out of that is compassionate and altruistic. So you cannot redefine terms. And this is what's going to happen unless we bring a real multidisciplinary, kind of a perspective on, study of very important qualities like compassion, because it's not like studying matter. If you're studying particle physics, you can be very, very objective. The third-person perspective is perfectly fine. But if you're studying mental phenomena, and particularly qualities like compassion that are so dear to how we define ourselves as moral beings, then you cannot just purely do it in a reductionist way and pretend all the insights of the past doesn't really matter. So this is where I think, I'm very, excited about the CCARE kind of story and its success in bringing the multiple voices together. And recently we had, some of you may have been familiar, we had an amazing conference in Telluride, which CCARE hosted and organized. And there were more than 50% of the speakers I did not know, which is a fantastic thing for me, because that shows, when we first had the conversation, you remember here on definition, most of the scientists, I knew them, their work, what they were doing. Now, this time in Telluride, there were perspectives coming from all sorts of directions, studying the caregiving, mechanism or nurturing mechanism from this perspective, from that perspective, from evolutionary perspective, which is fantastic. And in a way, what's happening is that it is kind of redefining what it means to be human. Because in the old, until quite recently, our conception of human nature was so dominated by supposedly Darwinian model, which turns out to be actually partial, because Darwin's own writings are beginning to show that he had a much more nuanced perspective. But it seems to be more of a Thomas Huxley's kind of take on Darwinism, where nature was seen as red in tooth and claw, and aggression, selfishness, and competitiveness were the defining features of our being. So to the point where, even the entire economic theory is built on this, based on this model. And, I have always felt really strange trying to read scientific papers that tries to explain altruism as a phenomenon, but essentially they are trying to explain it away as some kind of disguised selfishness. I mean, I was always thought there's something very contrived about this. It's trying to fit the facts to a particular theory. But now this whole thing is opening up, and this has huge implications.
It's interesting because Jinpa did say he's very non-contentious, which is true, but I think he also underestimates the power of his personality, although that power is in a small package. Because if you're around Jinpa for any length of time, not only is his intellect extraordinary, but his insights, advice, and wisdom to anyone who's been around him are incredibly useful, and that's, I think, why so many people like him to be with them on whatever journey it is.
I hope you will say that to my wife.
I'm not that convincing, Jinpa. The other, it's funny because Jinpa was saying how convincing I was. There was a recent article that was somewhere, I can't recall, but they were actually talking about some research that CCARE had funded and a project, and the fellow goes, well, I met Jim, and this isn't my field at all, but he convinced me. Well, I refused multiple times, but he kept coming back, and then I finally just gave in to him just to finally get him out of my hair. And he goes, now this is what I'm focused on. So but the extraordinary blessing of what we're doing is that because this has been established at CCARE, because Jinpa and others have been involved in this, I get emails every day from people saying, prior to the creation of CCARE, I had thought about doing research in this area. I thought this was so important, but my advisors told me it was impossible to have any type of a career or I would never get tenure. And I thank you so much because now this is maybe not mainstream, but almost mainstream where it's acceptable to think about this. And so really that's quite extraordinary. And that in and of itself has really been inspiring. Jinpa was alluding to this Science of Compassion conference that we had in Telluride. It's interesting because when I started this, I was having some conversations with different scientists, and I'm a neurosurgeon, and although that gives me a little credibility, fundamentally, this is not my area of research interest. So when I talked to some of these scientists, they would just look at me like, who are you? And I think the only reason they were nice to me was because I was big and scary. But it's funny because, I said, I read these papers and how can you compare this to that? I mean, I don't even understand. You guys aren't even using the same measures. How do you compare apples to apples? They go, well, you're not qualified to really talk about this or understand this. But I kept bringing this up more and more. And it was also the other thing I brought up is, there should be a meeting, a multidisciplinary meeting, because you guys are in these silos. You're not communicating, and there's so much richness in this multidisciplinary conversation. So suddenly, finding measures is the most important thing we have to do at this point in time, which is wonderful because it is important. And then the other thing is, following this conference in Telluride, which there were 300 people there all over the world. It was really amazing. But I got a number of emails from people saying, I had never met this people or this person or had looked at their research, but we had this conversation and I am now inspired to go in so many different directions because of what they do, and it's an area I didn't even know about, or the type of work they're doing can be so contributive to my own. So it's really been wonderful. As many of you know, and I think many of you who are here, you are aware that there is the research side, if you will, of CCARE. There's, if you will, a public education side. But, all this science, while it's wonderful to do, certainly on an intellectual level, unless we can give people tools to enrich their lives and reap the benefit, the psychological benefit, what we're finding more and more, the health benefit of being compassionate, while interesting, I don't think there's a reason to do it. And that's why, on a very practical level, we're looking to find tools which individuals can use to help themselves be more compassionate. And Jinpa has been incredible in regard to helping us develop a course here and with contributions from psychologists and a number of individuals, which is the training program that many of you will be engaged in soon. One of the things, before I have Jinpa talk about that, though, that I thought I would ask you to talk about is, we talk about self-compassion. And it's interesting that in the West, we so beat up on ourselves. But in the East, this is an interesting concept. In fact, it's not really a concept at all because it doesn't occur. And maybe you can give your thoughts on that before we start talking about the training.
Actually, talking about self-compassion, at Telluride, I had a long conversation with Christian Neff. I think she was one of the speakers in this series. And she has been instrumental in bringing the concept of self-compassion as a scientific construct. And she is probably the most important person who has been responsible for making that possible. She was telling me that because, sometimes we assume that it has something to do with cultural difference between East and West. And I was never really quite convinced of that kind of take on the problem of self-compassion. But she was telling me that she has developed this self-compassion scale, and it has been conducted in multiple countries. And she was saying that it's not so much East versus West, because she said that in South Korea and China and Taiwan, and it has done as bad as, the people score as bad as people score in the West. Thailand seems to be the best on that scale. So I think the phenomenon is probably more complicated than a question of difference between East and West. But one thing that, while working on the development of this compassion training program, you remember when we met with His Holiness in Seattle, after he pledged his 200,000 personal donation, he said two things. He said, and Gary Steinberg was there too, our chairman of the neurosurgery department, and now the director of Sintin was there, and was Bill Mobley there? I think Bill was there too. And His Holiness said, he said, make sure that whatever science you do is impeccable. So the highest quality of science. Then he said, whatever training program that you're going to develop, make sure it is completely universal and secularized. No promotion of Buddhism. And he was very explicit. And so we took that to heart. So, and one of the interesting things is that the very early version of the program was delivered here at Stanford, and it was studied, the effects studied by Jeannie Tsai and her team, and compared against some other active control groups. And I had a chance to sit down with the teacher who delivered the course, and for a lengthy period of time to debrief. And although I had some inkling of the problem of self-compassion in modern society, I wouldn't call it West per se, but I would see more as a traditional versus modern society. I wasn't actually ready to hear what he had to say. Because the initial version of the program was kind of, the stages were modeled very much on the traditional approach, where we already kind of operate from the premise that you have no problem with your own self-to-self compassion. So it begins with, compassion and loving kindness to a loved one, someone who's dear to you. Then it moves on to strangers, then to a difficult person, then to all beings. And then it was delivered twice, and in both of these cases, the self-compassion was proving to be, so we began with self and to a loved one. And it was just right at the beginning that the self-compassion was a real stumbling block. So, and then I started reading more about why this is the case. And, there was no real answer, but I think there was probably a lot to do with, like Paul Gilbert's work deals with, he deals with people with excessively, almost pathological, negative self-judgment and self-critical people. So self-compassion, the problem with the self-compassion partly probably has to do with people themselves judging themselves too harshly. And so they are, one of the things that we did was to really try to modify that so that we would take into account that issue, and then we redesigned the program. But I don't know, I don't think there is any, at this point, compelling study of why this is the case, other than a simple observation of the fact. Like I grew up in a traditional society, and in traditional societies, people will have low self-esteem, but self-hatred was never really a problem, at least when I was growing up as a kid. So people will have, less confidence and stuff, and most of these are in relation to specific skills. So, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at that. But whereas the problem with the self-hatred and self-negative judgment seems to be much more kind of, categorical. I'm not good at anything. So it's much more, it seems to have a much more universalizing language. I don't deserve this. Why should people love me? It seems to be, it's excessively, the language seems to be more universal, and it's not tied to a specific issue. Whereas in Asia, in the traditional societies, when people have less confidence, generally tends to be with specific skills. I can't speak good English, or I cannot do this because I'm not very good at this. But not in this blanket way where, I'm not good at anything, I'm a loser kind of thing. So that probably has to do with challenges in modern society where, performance is so highly valued. In fact, you have IQ, not emotional quotient, until Dan Goleman came up with the Emotional Intelligence book, which is based on the research of many other scientists, and then people started using EQ as well. But the whole modern education system is modeled on this IQ, which is primarily driven by academic performance. And also in traditional societies, if there are challenges, that the challenges are very real. It may have to do with, kind of poverty or lack of something to eat. But whereas in modern society, the challenges are not of the traditional kind that people are, human beings, evolutionary, are used to dealing with. They are much more some kind of dark cloud hanging in the air, which is in the background. It's always, kind of winding you up. So probably I think the phenomenon is much more complex, and I hope just at some point some clever social scientists will be able to unpack this. But I don't really, all of my ideas are just simple conjectures.
Well, as you point out, I think, though, which is, I think, obviously correct, is when we say the East, maybe what we're really saying is the pre-industrialized East.
Yeah.
It wasn't a notion, but whenever a country has become industrialized, I guess that's the start of self-hatred, it seems like.
Well, I don't know if, I think it's, you are right. It is the industrial age, but at the same time, I think it has more to do with traditional societal structure versus modern structure. Because if you look at something like India, which is very industrialized, but at the same time, they've been able to keep the family structure very strong. And on top of that, for me, India is a very interesting example because and partly because I suppose it's a very ancient nation. The culture is very old. So you have, people are able to live with seeming dichotomies. So you can have someone who is top engineer, but in the morning, the person will have religious devotional practices and may even put the mark on the forehead. But it doesn't seem to have problem with that and the academic, secular side of scientific side of their psyche. So I think there is a lot more kind of larger factors in the culture that people can identify with, tap into, feel connected with. Whereas the image of human being in strictly secular, modern society is actually quite scary. It expects a lot on the part of the individual. It expects the individual to be able to create his or her own system of meaning, moral compass. I mean, it's a lot. And I don't think human beings are built to be able to shoulder all of this and trying to be able to explain every aspect of our existence in rational terms. That's, and this, in traditional societies, I think people don't expect that. I mean, they seem to have an ability to live with dichotomies where you have aspects of your existence which lend itself to rational understanding and explanation, but there could be dimensions of your life where you don't bring that rationality, and there's a ease with which you live with these different dimensions. And modern society and modern conception of human nature, including even religious beliefs, are very driven by this one-dimensional conception of truth, and truth in the sense of propositional truth. It's either or truth. And then when you subject even your religious belief to that, then everything becomes, if something is true, it becomes literally true. So then you have, people who are kind of forced to stick to some kind of literal truth of statements in the sacred text, which if you're more sophisticated, then you're able to understand the truths of these teachings in a more nuanced way, without reducing the meaning of truth only on this unidimensional level. So I think this has probably more to do with traditional versus modern society.
Well, I'd just like to comment. I think many of you know that in our modern society, we have an epidemic of depression, isolation, loneliness. I mean, there was a survey that was done that showed that 25% of people in the West do not feel that they have someone to talk to if they're suffering. Can you imagine? 25% of people have no one they feel comfortable talking to. And it gets back to the same issue of, people work together, yet they never know a thing about the other person. They greet them, they say hello, they may have lunch, but that person sitting next to you may be going through the worst crisis in their life, and none of them ever feel comfortable enough to share with you that they're suffering. Because, number one, in the West, for some reason, we don't feel comfortable about being vulnerable, and we're terrified of being judged if we share something that is heartfelt. And it's really, really quite sad.
But having said that, I don't want to give the wrong impression that I'm being here overly critical of modern culture and modern society, because one thing where the modern society in general, and particularly the Western civilization, has got it right as a society, is the balance between individual and the collective. Asian societies are still struggling. And modern society, probably from the 18th, 19th century onwards with the Enlightenment, and have come to terms with this balance and decided to have a conception of society where, fundamentally we will trust the individual. And then to the point where you create kind of boundaries around the individual beyond which even the collective or the state will have no kind of legitimate authority unless for some extraordinary circumstances. And to the point where individual can have recourse to take the collective and the society to court for redressing of injustices. So in that sense, I think the Western modern society's conception of society is actually very, very, I would in fact argue that's very, very deeply spiritual, kind of moral principle. But in the process, it has also lost in touch with kind of a larger humanity, So that in an ideal world, we would want that conception of society where the individual there's a certain sacredness about the protection of the individual, but at the same time, it has this richness of being able to live with myths, being able to, kind of live with dichotomies and not feel the urge to reduce everything to this, uni-level understanding of what truth is. So maybe it's a dream, but I think, it's doable. I mean, now the modern science is getting so complicated. Even the picture of reality emerging from science, particularly at the quantum level, seems to be very complicated. It's already suggesting a very, very complex reality. So this whole idea of that everything can be rationally explained is probably, not going to have much force eventually.
To comment about your comparison to India and how they've held that together, but don't you think one of the problems in modern society, especially in the West, is that there's no longer a family unit that sticks together? I mean, in those cultures that you're describing, you have the grandfather, the grandparents, the family, the children. They're either in the same place or in close proximity. There's an ongoing interaction, and that provides a framework so that you don't feel isolated or lost. Sure. And those people who are closest to you recognize when there's an issue and confront you with the issue.
But I mean, even in the West, you do see, particularly the Latin cultures like Spain and Italy, the family structures are still very strong. So I think there seems to be something in the Anglo-American culture where the family structures seem to be much weaker. But I think it's this is a very, very complicated kind of question. And but I think in an ideal world, even though the society may become secular, one would still hope that the society values spirituality. May not value traditional religion, but society needs to value spirituality.
You sort of alluded to quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and the next step, of course, is particle entanglement. And at least if you talk to Deepak Chopra, quantum consciousness. Maybe you can just comment on that. I'm not sure what you'll comment, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, I don't really have anything to say on that, really. I mean, I've been privileged to be with His Holiness at some of the most interesting, deeply engaging conversations between His Holiness and a physicist, particularly Anton Zeilinger, who's at Vienna. He's one of the key people in the quantum entanglement and teleportation kind of research, and Arthur Zines, who's our current new president of Mind and Life. But one thing that is interesting for me as a Buddhist scholar is to really be exposed to the complexity of the picture of reality that is emerging from the quantum physics description, where even what we consider something to be material is also very, very complicated. Because generally, in a naive kind of layperson's understanding, when we think of something as being physical, material, we immediately start thinking in terms of, spatial extension properties and a specific location in space and all of this. But when you listen to the quantum, I mean, none of these have, especially some of the very, very subtle level of reality, these sort of disappear. So then, I mean, can we still call these phenomena material? So I think the kind of material and the non-material kind of the boundaries blur. And, but it's interesting. I mean, for someone who has been trained in classical Buddhist philosophy, these kind of uncertainties are very exciting because, Buddhists, sometimes I describe Buddhism as, I'm talking about the classical Indian philosophical tradition, Buddhist tradition, as being orthodox when it comes to practice, but almost nihilist or relativistic when it comes to philosophy or metaphysics. So uncertainty is really a kind of a historical part of the Buddhist philosophical consciousness. So for us, to see that kind of uncertainty and struggling to live with that kind of uncertainty at the heart of our conception of reality is actually quite exciting because it's almost like finding a kind of a conversation partner who's beginning to say the same kind of language.
I actually was at a conference, which actually Deepak Chopra invited me to, and that's why I brought his name up, and it was a number of physicists talking about quantum consciousness. And Deepak had said to me, he said, Jim, I'd like you to talk at this conference. But he never told me what I was to talk about, nor when I was going to talk about it. So the conference is going on, this is a 2-day conference, and he never says anything to me. So we're like up to almost the last speaker. He turns to me and says, Jim, I think you should summarize everything. And I don't know anything about quantum consciousness. So I got up in front of this group and I said that. I said, I don't know anything about quantum consciousness. I don't know anything about particle physics or particle entanglement. But what I do know is that we're all entangled. And that entanglement is love. So on that note, thank you. Thank you, Jinpa.
Thank you.
You used the word spiritual and spirituality in a very positive way. And I regularly wrestle with how to define that word. So I was hoping you would solve the problem for me.
Oh, no, that's, I don't think like you, I intuitively feel that we should be able to make a distinction between spirituality and religion. And His Holiness speaks about what he calls 2 levels of spirituality. One is a level of spirituality in the sense of, teachings embedded in a traditional religious system or tradition. The other one is what he calls basic spirituality. And by this, he's talking more about values and qualities that come out of our basic nature as human beings. So qualities of compassion, altruism, forgiveness, sense of caring, a feeling of connection with others. So in that sense, one could almost argue spiritual values are almost like equivalent to moral, fundamental ethical values. So that one could sort of understand it in those terms. But I would probably add to this some sense of connection to something larger than yourself. And I would argue that you need not specifically articulate what that larger entity is. It could be humanity. It could be a sense of belonging to something bigger that's part of a large narrative of what the world is, what reality is. So I don't think, this is where sometimes, I have issues with a very modern perspective, which is to be very clear and specific. Clarity is generally very good, but sometimes that kind of clarity and specificity may not be possible. So I think I would argue that in addition to this fundamental ethical values that we all share, that is really at the heart of the teachings of all the great religious traditions throughout history, a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness to something larger, would be part of that definition.
And I mean, I think that's also the definition of transcendence,
Yeah.
which is to feel your place in the world, a connection to the world, and a deep fundamental knowledge that we're all connected. And I think that's really the core of our humanity, my view. Yes, sir.
First of all, thanks very much for your presentation today. The short question is, what is the source of compassion? The longer version of that question is it merely something we generate in our own thought and that can be observed in an objective manner? Or is it perhaps the expression or reflection of a heretofore unobserved divine consciousness, a consciousness that may only ever be observed through its effects?
Well, thank you for that softball. I'm sure Jinpa has the answer.
I think, again, for our purpose, in the context of C-Care, since we are really operating within the framework of universal secular understanding, and here, before I say this, I think I need to make a clarification point. When I use the word secular, I use it in the way in which His Holiness understands it, not in the way in which sometimes it's popularly defined, which is a sort of a contra perspective to religious perspective. But the way in which His Holiness understands the word secular is in an inclusive sense, which is not partial to any particular religious standpoint, but it's also not antithetical to a non-religious standpoint. So in a sense, it's sort of a more basic, fundamental human perspective. So since within the context of C-Care's work, we are not really moving into specific religious perspective, so then our understanding of compassion as a phenomenon is really framed by that larger agenda of how do we understand in this universal, secular kind of way. And here, inevitably, evolutionary perspective has to be an important part of it. And, you know, the way in which, and here, the Buddhist understanding and the secular evolutionary understanding sort of come together, where we see compassion as ultimately a kind of a natural instinct that comes out of our nurturing mechanism that we are equipped with by nature. So whether as mothers or parents, we have that ability to care for someone who is in pain. And that empathetic quality is very, very natural. And the Buddhists would argue that this comes from the very kind of virtue of the fact that we are sentient beings. And sentient is defined in terms of organism that has the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. And pain is such a powerful experience that when we see someone in acute pain, without any thought process, conscious thought processes, we can immediately feel for that person or an animal. And that would be the default response. Now, the Buddhist would argue that in fact, to turn off, you have to act against the default mechanism, to really choose not to feel it. But the default response would be that of caring. And that's because we share at this fundamental level the sentient nature, which is the ability to experience pain. So, so within the context of this secular framework, we would see compassion as coming out, that being the primary source. But compassion, one thing that we have to bear in mind is that, again, the term compassion can be understood in many different contexts. Sometimes compassion can be understood more as a disposition rather than an emotion. Sometimes compassion needs to be understood more as a felt experience, which would be an emotion. So sometimes compassion is a perspective. So, you know, that's why in the compassion training, the idea behind compassion training is to learn to move from the stage of feeling to turn it into a kind of a mood or a trait, and eventually to make it part of your character. So that when you are confronted with a situation, your instinctive reaction would be coming from that perspective, that standpoint, a compassionate standpoint, which is non-judgmental, being open to the experience of the other. Because when we see someone in pain and suffering, we don't negatively judge the person. Our first reaction is to feel sorry, to feel a sense of caring. And then later on, when we go to the thought process, conscious thought process level, then we may start thinking, he did it for himself and, he deserved it. Then that's already we're at the thought kind of level. But our immediate instinct would be to feel the pain. And that is where there is an openness, there is a kind of a non-judgmental reaching out, being able to opening yourself to connect. So, the ideal in compassion training is to train yourself to a point where your first reaction to a given situation would be coming from that standpoint. And if you can see individuals like Mother Teresa, whom I did not have the honor to meet. Actually, I did meet her in person once, but someone like His Holiness, I've had the privilege to serve him for over 26 years now, 27 years. And, he is an example of that we can do it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that he's not critical. He can be very critical and tough. But his immediate first response would be coming from that compassionate standpoint. And imagine if we are able to do this, what would it mean in our own personal life, in our relationship with our spouse? Imagine the radical implications this would have. Because, immediately before judging, if you're able to reach out from the compassionate standpoint, and then you calm down yourself, then you're able to see the problem in a much more enlightened way.
Just to comment also, if you think about our evolution, the cost of our ability to abstract think, I think, and have language, and even have a perception of a future and a past, the cost of that is this prolonged gestational period and this requirement for the mother to nurture her child. And there has to be an inherent, very strong ability to bond so the mother doesn't abandon the child. So these mechanisms have developed over millions of years. And it's interesting because I think many of you have heard of this hormone called oxytocin, or what people call the love or the bonding hormone. The interesting thing is that within your in-group, it actually, if you snort it, makes you feel very connected, but it's limited. So if these people are outside of your defined in-group, it doesn't have the same effect. And I think ultimately that is the challenge for all of us in our modern society, and actually, hopefully this training brings about, is that the challenge is to expand your in-group so that it's not just your family, your mother, your brother, your sister, but it's all humanity. And that's going to be what results in our survival as a species, I think. Yes, sir.
I was in one of the pilot programs for the training, and I can affirm that the self-compassion piece was by far the hardest. Having compassion for one's enemy is relatively easy compared to oneself, it seems, particularly among high achievers, and there seem to be a lot of those at Stanford and Silicon Valley. I think most of us, and certainly I, carry a deeply held belief. It doesn't even seem like a belief. It seems like a fact that there is some part of us that is not good enough and never will be. And life is a continuous struggle around that drama, even in moments when we can, quote, give ourselves compassion. That's still an antidote to what this foundational apparent fact of deficit. I hope I'm not speaking only for myself. I trust I'm not.
Nobody feels that way.
Yeah, except me. I knew I was different. And I have seen, and this idea that we naturally want to give compassion, I have seen as it applies to others. I don't think that's always true for oneself. In my work with clients and with myself and with friends, I can see that the persistence of self-criticism is deep. It's even unquestioned as something we choose to do. It just seems the way it is. So the idea that this is a foreign concept, a strange, bizarre idea for Tibetans, is very intriguing. And I wonder if you could say, how would a Tibetan think? How would, if we were all Tibetans, if we were all pre-moderns, what would our perspective be that would allow a completely different point of view about ourselves?
I mean, I think thank you for really clarifying and explaining this problem of self-compassion and sharing your own experience of having, taken the course. I don't want to give the wrong impression that somehow the traditional societies, people are totally at ease with themselves, which I think is not true. But at the same time, I think there is less angst about self-to-self relation. Now that may have, that may be partly a function of the society being not that sophisticated or articulate or not highly developed scientifically or having a kind of a deeper insight into one's own psychology. It could be many things. It could be partly also because there is a greater sense of spiritual values and sense of connection so that the individuals don't feel deeply, at a deep level, lonely. That may be another factor. So I think it's a very, very complicated factor because in my own life, in a sense, I'm kind of living at the intersection of two worlds. And I grew up within the traditional Tibetan society in India, became a monk, and then later on, and sometimes my wife teases me and says that you're no real Tibetan, because in a sense I'm also quite westernized or modernized, because of my facility with English and having worked for His Holiness and having had a much larger exposure. But at the same time, I also have my families in South India, my cousins, many of them are about my age, their children. And it's, I can see that how, in a sense, there are certain aspects of my own personal psyche which, are not there in my cousins. And then there are certain things, there are certain blind spots in my cousins' kind of upbringing, in their own self-to-self relation. So I think it's not either or this is good and that is bad. I think the phenomenon is very, very complex. But so that's why I think it has a lot to do with expectations. Because modern society creates much higher expectations for individual. And also the constant pressure to perform. And also having your own self-identity tied up with your performance. To the point where, when you introduce in the West, you say, what do you do? Whereas in Asia, now it's changing. But when I was growing up as a kid, people will say, hello, but nobody will say, what do you do? So, these things reflect societal's value and it's sort of, in Buddhism, there's this idea of, human beings as being conditioned beings. And conditioning is what makes us who we think we are. And there's a lot of societal conditioning that goes on, which many of these processes of conditioning is quite oblique to us. We don't know we're being conditioned. But you can never really completely escape conditioning anyway, because if you're going to be born in a particular culture and society, you're going to be, absorbing the norms and the cultural values of that society that you're a part of. So I think it probably has more to do with kind of modern pressures for performance and your identity being tied up with that and your constant kind of, worry that you're going to be judged according to that yardstick rather than your intrinsic value of your qualities of who you are as a human being. So I think it's a very, very, complicated. I'm sorry instead of shedding lights on the phenomenon, I'm making it even more complicated.
Yes.
First, thank you so much for your conversation, and thank you for your incredible part in setting up the protocols in the course, because I took the course and it's extremely valuable in my life, so thank you. And I'm also interested in this issue of self-compassion and hearing that we in the West rate so difficult in terms of self-compassion. So my question is, if you're talking about having a course and teaching people and then having to go back and start with self-compassion, is it possible if you don't even have self-compassion, can you begin to have compassion for others?
That's a very, very good question. I think, that's why we need to have a much more nuanced understanding of what is meant by the word compassion. I don't think we should have a very simplistic notion of what it is. It's a thing that you either have it or you don't have it. I think it's much more complicated. Although for the sake of, conversation, even in the Buddhist text, there are definitions of what the phenomena is. But I think we need to have an appreciation that it is a very complex phenomenon. So in some sense, if you don't have a good, healthy, secure self-to-self relation, it's going to be very difficult to have genuine compassion to others on a sustained basis. So I would qualify it in a sustained manner, because then you may get tired, you may get distressed, and you get burned out. Whereas if you have a more self-to-self healthy relationship and a genuine acceptance of who you are, and in some sense, being a friend to yourself and to yourself, once you have that, then in a sense you have a much richer reservoir, and you are able to really kind of be more mindful and aware of not confusing someone's suffering with your own distress, and being able to be there for the other person, when you feel compassion for someone. But that does not mean, if you have problem with self-compassion, that you are not going to be a compassionate person. Because I would argue that, comparatively, Western Judeo-Christian, particularly Christian societies, on an aggregate level, much more compassionate. You can just look at the percentage of charitable giving in the West versus East, and even between Europe and America, and between Canada and America, there's a big difference. America is a very compassionate society, very charitable when it's measured, because charity giving is generosity, and generosity is an expression of compassion, and generosity is the behavioral test of whether you are compassionate or not. And on that scale, America is very, very high. And that's coming primarily from the Christian heritage. Because in a sense, if you look at New Testament is like shining a spotlight on the compassionate aspect of the divinity. This is how I, as a Buddhist, would look at New Testament and appreciate its value. And so charity is a very important part of Christian heritage. And the story of Jesus' life, the whole idea, image of Jesus on the cross, it's a compassionate story. And so I think I don't think it's correct to say that if you have a problem with self-compassion, that you cannot be compassionate. It's more complicated. But to be able to have a good reservoir of compassion to draw from, where you're not going to be burned out, where you are going to be truly there for the other when necessary, then having a self-compassion makes a huge difference.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I'm sorry for the people who had questions, because I know they would be very interesting, but I bet you we would all be here all night. And I would love to be, if you guys would all like to be. But I think some of you would like to go on and do some other things. So thank you again so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.